To the best of my recollection, I've never met a single other person who behaved in such a strange way. He didn't appear to be really that focused on markets and trading, and he appeared instead to be focused in creating a kind of cartoonish notion of what a billionaire might be in a very poorly drawn James Bond or Marvel comic movie. Here's what went into my meeting of Jeffrey Epstein. My recollection is that Jeffrey Epstein had a staff of young adult women who I would guess were in their late 20s, perhaps early 30s. They seemed very professional. They seemed very attractive, and that they seemed to take his schedule and all of the sort of incidental executive function duties off of his hands. Principally, I dealt with them, according to my recollection, and not with Jeffrey directly. I believe I became aware that Jeffrey wanted to see me. And since I was at that time involved in a small hedge fund, I went to see him on 71st Street across from the Frick Museum. When I got to the door, it was an extraordinary experience. He, in fact, was living in what was, for Manhattan, which is famous for relatively small dwellings, even for the very rich, in a very large townhouse. I went through the door, I was greeted, was treated professionally, and I was led to a waiting room. In that waiting room, which I believe was off to the left as you entered, I sat in the chair for a while, and I noticed that there was a large mechanical piece of art, and I believe that it had some electronics to it. After a while of sitting in my chair, my recollection is that I went up to this art object and I started trying to inspect it. As I was looking at the art object, which I thought was quite innocent, I suddenly thought that I saw something like a lipstick camera. That is a very small camera whose lens was staring straight at me. My first thought was, holy cow, I've discovered that there's a hidden camera that has been trained on me while I've been in this room. I thought myself to be rather clever for having found it. But my second thought was exactly the reverse of this. I bet this isn't that difficult to find. The object that it was buried in attracts attention, and it must be that people who look at this object invariably find the camera. And then I started asking myself, am I supposed to find the camera? Is this a test? Is this person trying to make sure I'm comfortable with being under surveillance? The whole thing was now quite queer, and I went back and I sat down as I recall it. Shortly thereafter, almost responsive to finding the camera, my recollection is that I was called out of this room and I was led to the back where I was to wait for Jeffrey Epstein in a very large room with an enormous dining table. Now, what was most memorable about this dining table was that it had a tablecloth that I thought to be incredibly inappropriate. What I recall is that it had the appearance of a draped coffin, because the tablecloth was an extremely large American flag. If I recall correctly, there was another gentleman, perhaps another hedge fund person or a science person, who sat to my left. And I stared at this tablecloth and I thought, oh, you're going to serve me food on a tablecloth made out of the flag of my country? Or perhaps you're going to give me a beverage that might spill on the American flag? Is this a test of some kind of my loyalty to my country, or whether I have some sort of morality that isn't burdened by some petty reverence to an inanimate object? I couldn't tell what was going on, but I started getting extremely agitated and in fact angry. And I think my feelings involved an expletive, which is F the person who decided that this was a good idea to put an American flag as a tablecloth to test new people coming to the house. My recollection is that Jeffrey entered from the right with a young woman. In my mind, I remember her as being perhaps 22, 23. She was extremely attractive. As I recall, Jeffrey sat down and began bouncing this woman on his knee. So he motioned for her to sit down, and she appeared to be quite happy in this role as Jeffrey asked questions and discussed science, theories I had about markets, how they related to gauge theory, theoretical physics. I don't remember the man saying much to me who was also in the room at the time. And so all I have a recollection of is the four of us, Jeffrey, the woman on his leg, and the other gentleman and myself. My recollection is also that in order to test our willpower and concentration, that Jeffrey would bounce this woman occasionally, that she would giggle in order to test our resolve as to whether we could stay focused in the conversation. I found him to be quite intelligent. He clearly was no slouch, but I also found that every single interaction with him resulted in my being back-footed conversationally. He was constantly trying to throw me off guard. And at some level, I was also irritated and angered. I was trying to keep my cool during this entire interaction. And I thought to myself, I don't know anybody who behaves this way. I knew several rich people at that point in my life, and I've known many more very wealthy people, perhaps billionaires of 10 and 11 figure fortunes. To the best of my recollection, I've never met a single other person who behaved in such a strange way. He didn't appear to be really that focused on markets and trading, and he appeared instead to be focused in creating a kind of cartoonish notion of what a billionaire might be in a very poorly drawn James Bond or Marvel comic movie. And in so doing, I came to start to believe that I was not really talking to somebody who was a hedge fund manager or a financier, but that I was instead talking to a very intelligent and extremely charismatic man. My recollection was that he was magnetically handsome, perhaps a little off in certain ways. Certainly he's been compared to Ralph Lauren, which was my thought. But he was prematurely gray, if I recall the image, and he had a kind of charisma that could probably be quantified in an era of facial recognition. There was something very, very unusual and compelling about him, despite the fact that he was more than a little bit lubricious. The meeting ended abruptly at some point, and I walked out. I remember feeling that there are very few times in your life when you feel the hair on the back of your neck rise up. I don't know whether that's literally what happened, but it was certainly the sense that I had met something unholy. And I remember calling my wife, and I remember talking to her, and I've used the word construct ever since.